But there are people that are like that, right? That are like just now getting upset. And it's like, well, why weren't you upset when they murdered Philando Castile? Murdered in the same state, by the way, where George Floyd was murdered.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad.
That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Black Lives Matter.
That's the tagline. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, that should be all you really need to hear. But I think we're going to keep talking about things that relate to the fact that Black Lives Matter. That
is like 79% accurate. So today we are going to talk about Octavia Butler's Blood Child, which is a really interesting story that I think we're going to have some squishy feels about. And we're also going to talk about I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is a new article in Tor.com by Tochi Onyebuchi. And we will be sharing some resources. But before we get into that in reverse order of what I just said, we should note, in case you are not following us on Twitter, that we did make a little bit of an announcement, which may explain the topic of this particular podcast, which is that given the present happenings in the United States, and by happenings we mean the protesting happening in literally every state in the United States and happening across the globe in multiple countries, in service of the message of Black Lives Matter and against police brutality. We are going to be changing the focus that we sort of had up to this point to a focus that will look at writing by people of color, especially Black to begin, but also Indigenous and other groups that are marginalized. Our primary motivation right now is going to be to switch up to talking very explicitly and overwhelmingly about Black writers, Black issues, Black films, given that a lot of what I think Jen and I both are recognizing is that the industries in Hollywood and in publishing tend not to privilege those voices. And that's what we're doing. And we're kind of doing it with a big fuck you to anybody who doesn't care about that. If that's not your thing, I don't think that's any of you listening because you've been with us through various other initiatives that we've done. This is just a focus that Jen and I are doing at least through the rest of this year, if not maybe permanently.
Yes, everything that Sean just said.
Okay, so what this will look like for the show is going to be really simple. Torture Cinema is going to stay basically the same because we're not jerks, and we're not going to rip on people's movies to be assholes. Also, we have a couple of things that are still remaining that we already started before we made this shift, and we're going to finish those. So the biggest one is going to be our Kim Stanley Robinson discussion on The Wild Shore. That'll be coming very soon. But beyond that, it's going to be a totally different world in here.
Yep, a better world. Sean and I have been working on this and on trying to boost marginalized voices for quite a long time now, which is part of the reason that many years ago Sean started the initiative of World Voices in science fiction and fantasy, and we've continued that. I really made it my focus, especially the last few years, as I've been the main producer of the show, while Duke has been getting his PhD. And obviously this was just another sort of reminder that progress has not been made, despite what activists have been doing, despite what Black people have been doing in the United States for literally centuries at this point. There just has not been enough progress. And so that's part of the reason that we are choosing right now with this reminder of the last couple of weeks, especially as prompted by the murder of George Floyd, and right before that, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, and so many other Black lives destroyed on a daily basis. Not just because of police brutality, but because of systemic racism. And so this is an opportunity for us to make it even more of a focus and to make that statement in support of Black Lives Matter and against police brutality. We're here to say, and obviously you all know me, like, fuck you is my favorite phrase. You have your own fuck you. I mean, obviously, fuck you is also, like, something that you love as well. I'm just usually the one yelling it much louder.
You also, I think it would be fair to say that between the two of us, you're the more politically radical of the two.
I am a raging leftist. It's not that you don't have a fuck you inside of you as well, because I know that you do. It's just that you have never been as explicit as I have, and that's fine. Like, not everybody needs to be explicitly fuck you in the world. Some people can be more politic about it, and that's good too. There is a place for that. It's not my place.
It's not your place? No, not at all.
I much prefer being in the I'm going to rage position in the world.
I think for me, I just hit the point where on this particular issue, I'm trying to say this without it making it seem like, oh, you're just a white guy and you're just now figuring out that this is a problem, because that's not what this is. But there are people that are like that, right? That are like just now getting upset. And it's like, well, why weren't you upset when they murdered Philando Castile? Murdered in the same state, by the way, where George Floyd was murdered.
Mm-hmm. By the same police department, if I recall.
Yeah, same police department. Fuck the Minneapolis PD. I'm serious. I'm so glad that they are losing all their contracts for security all over mostly the Minneapolis area, obviously.
Fuck yeah.
But I think for me, I hit this point where it was like, if 5 years ago, I would have been really pissed off. I would have been angry. It would have been like, yes, Black Lives Matter. And 2014, the big protests. I was like, yes, all that, very much so. And like, all right, like we got the protest now, like let's get to the point where what's the change? What's the policy going to be? Let's do it. And obviously nothing happened. And then now we've hit this point, I would argue very strongly that we actually have a fascist in the Oval Office. And not just a fascist, a white supremacist fascist.
Well, yeah, that's clear.
I don't think he's intelligent as one, and I don't know if he realizes he is one, because I think I said in the article I wrote about this that Donald Trump notoriously doesn't read, so I don't even think he understands what those terms mean. And so we have a fascist in the office who just today gave some speech where he was like, the job numbers are good, George Floyd would be happy. Fucking fuck you. How fucking dare you? That shit's going on. And then you have these two, what I would say are very blatant and irrefutable instances of black men and women being murdered. One is Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. One is Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her bedroom after police broke in looking for a black man, which I guess if you're racist, everybody fucking looks the same regardless of gender, which, okay. And then you have George Floyd, who was choked to death on the ground. To me, I just think I've just hit this point where it's like, I don't necessarily like looting. I don't necessarily like rioting. I don't like destruction of property. I would love it if we could just do peaceful protests and like that would be it. But at the same time, like nothing else is working. Like, what else are we supposed to do? This should not be happening. It should not have been a fucking question that the police officers who killed George Floyd should have been immediately arrested. At least one of them straight up charged with murder and the other is accessories. I don't care what fucking degree. They should be charged. It just should have happened fucking immediately when you saw the video. It's not a question to me. The two men who killed Ahmaud Arbery should have been charged with murder immediately. And then we could have determined if there was hate crime. Apparently Georgia doesn't have a hate crime law because Georgia is fucking stupid. Breonna Taylor, those police officers should be behind bars right now. They broke into her house, they shot her multiple times, and they murdered her in her own home. How the fuck do you even murder her in her own home? How the fuck is this going on? I don't fucking understand it. It's absolutely bat fucking shit crazy. I'm pissed off is what I am, and so I'm at this point where it's like, this has got to stop, and if that means we have to do something that seems fairly mild, which is just saying, like, we're just canceling basically all of whatever we were going to do for the rest of the year and fuck off to whoever doesn't like it. We're just going to do people of color, especially black people right now, to try to highlight their work and do what small little thing this stupid, dorky little podcast can do for that community. Then that's what we're going to do. Part of me is like, I'm like up in Bemidji. I'm 4 hours away from Minneapolis, roughly. I'm not anywhere where I feel like I can do anything. Like all I can do is yabber on Twitter and do a podcast, and teach. I can teach, right? And I can try to teach these things, but like I'm not there. I can't help. I don't know what to fucking do.
So nothing that Sean and I say today will be sufficient to match the overwhelming need that this country and the world has in terms of dealing with our history of colonialism, slavery, systemic racism, continued segregation, capitalist exploitation, police brutality, current levels of fascism and white supremacy, the murder of Black people that happens on a daily basis, not just in the United States, but in especially former colonies around the world. Nothing we say will be sufficient to fight that. And as Sean said, we are a tiny little podcast with tiny little voices. But at the same time, as I've been saying for days, and I don't know who originated it, but white silence is violence. Now, granted, some white people
It should be silent.
should be fucking silent. But at the same time, I actually appreciate them saying something because then I know that their entrails will be danced in on the day of reckoning.
Yeah. There is a sense of some white people need to read the room.
Yes.
Like the one vegan lady who is like, Black lives and animal lives, it's just the same, and you should be a vegan. And I'm like, you're not getting it, and you need to shut the fuck up and take a step back.
So yes, but white silence is violence in the sense that if we do not say anything in the face of the injustice that we are witnessing and believe is happening, but while also listening to Black leaders and Black voices, because that's the most important fucking thing right now, is that our silence is violence unless we're told to shut the fuck up by Black people, frankly, okay? Like, really, if they tell you to shut the fuck up, it means that you clearly have not been listening, so shut the fuck up.
Usually if they're telling you to shut the fuck up, it's because you're saying some dumb shit.
And then go back to listening and learning and boost their voices. But if you're not even out there boosting their voices, I'm sorry, but I am 100% at the point where I believe you are complicit in the violence. You might not see it that way. You might see it as, well, this is not the space that I choose to do that, to talk about that. But if you are faced with this injustice, and someone literally 2 feet away from you says something, and you say nothing, you are 100% complicit in the violence that is occurring in this country and around the world. That's the point that I'm at. So my fuck you is a pretty large one. I think one of the things I'm realizing is that the silence that I'm witnessing on a daily basis from white people is very telling. And it's telling me it's not something that I want around me.
The way I look at this is, we're probably very similar, Jen. It's that we cannot, you cannot say to me, like, I value diversity, or I want a more equal, equitable society, or egalitarian society, or whatever, sort of vague liberal ideal that you've subscribed to. You can't say you want your Star Trek future where everybody seems to get along. You can't do that and then also not sort of challenge your preconceptions and make sure that you speak out on things and make sure that it's clear that you're going to have the back of people who don't have the same power that you do. And a lot of people are, the example that you were giving of the people that you dropped off of your Twitter was like a whole chunk of your followers were still following J.K. Rowling, and we don't know exactly why they're still following. Maybe they just don't realize it, but some of them certainly do. And there was an implication of one of the tweet threads in response to you, which was that some of these people almost certainly know that J.K. Rowling is a TERF, and she is a TERF, and they are too afraid to unfollow because they may work in the publishing industry and they're afraid of the effect of that. And I don't know how true that is, but based on what I understand of the publishing industry, yeah, probably is true that there would be repercussions for some people. But that's part of the fucking problem.
Yeah.
We cannot uproot those systemic problems if people are going to be complicit in it. And if people are not going to be held accountable when they are complicit and they know it. It's one thing if you don't realize it. It's one thing if you you don't know something, right? Because as long as you're open to hearing new things, you'll at least learn and you might change it. It's when you know that it's a problem and you just sit there and do nothing. And this is what I was saying on one of your Facebook things about like the good cop theory thing,
right?
Which is like for the oppressed, there are really only three groups. There are the people who love the system, the people that don't but don't do anything, and the people that don't but do something. And the only groups that matter are the first one and the last one, because that middle group is indistinguishable from the first.
Right.
So you can't sit there and say, well, I'm not going to talk about these things, but I disagree with the, extrajudicial murdering of black people on the street by police officers, but I'm not going to say anything about it. No, I'm sorry, you can't do that anymore. We are beyond the point in which you can play that game. That game cannot be played. People need to be called on it, and if your life gets a little bit uncomfortable because people don't want to be your fucking friend because you're complicit, well, them's the breaks. That's the consequences now, and there need to be consequences. This is like, when people say cancel culture, I say that's bullshit. It's not cancel culture, it's consequences culture. And if you're upset about it, you're upset about people having consequences for their actions. And right now, we have way too little consequences for a lot of really fucked up actions.
I am choosing to enforce consequences, and it's not easy for me. It is hard to take a stand, but it's a fuck of a lot easier for me than it has been for black people in this country since we started bringing them over as slaves. So what little discomfort I am experiencing, it's just nothing. It's nothing. It really is fucking nothing. And you making one little retweet, and I'm not talking about like doing it performatively, but I think it's really telling that when people aren't even bothering with that level of action, right? Because we can see your history. We can read your history if you are on Twitter. We know what actions you have taken. And frankly, like, I have been unfollowing people that they might be out here for queer lives, which is awesome. I appreciate your activism for queer people in this country. But if those actions do not also include black people, they have queer people too.
Yep.
If you are not also saying it for them, then you are not an ally, and your activism it's fucking pointless, frankly.
It's not intersectional, and any activism that's not intersectional is inherently invalid for me.
Exactly.
It has to be an intersectional. You can't have feminism that's not intersectional. It doesn't make any sense. There are women who are black. There are women who are white. They're like, it's just fucking obvious. This is the problem. It's about fucking obvious things. Like, you and I might differ. You certainly are a little bit more aggressive with your blocking and unfollowing, because I think your line is further in. But like, for me, I don't even understand where there can be a conversation or a debate about the very basic idea that black people should not be getting murdered by the police, right? That, to me, I don't even give two shits. Like, the only context in which it makes sense to me that somebody should be killed by police officers is if literally they have a literal gun, an actual gun, and they're shooting at people. And then, like, yeah, okay, at that point, like, the gloves are off, because what else do you do?
Well, there's actually still de-escalation opportunities in that situation.
I'll be honest, I don't really give two shits about, like, a school shooter who's just running around murdering children.
Oh, no, they can die.
At that point, I think de-escalation's pointless.
Although, interestingly, if it's a white school shooter,
they always survive. Probably... They get to turn themselves
in.
So
weird!
But a black man potentially uses a counterfeit 20, and that's a murderable offense. So, like, for me, we have different lines, but my line is very clearly this is not even a debate on this particular topic. This should not happen, regardless of whether you think that the police should be abolished, which I think Jen and I are more or less pretty much on the same page on, which is that they should be. We can haggle over that part, but like, this shouldn't even be a debate.
Yeah, if you fundamentally don't believe that police should be abolished, you're wrong, but
we can debate that at least. We can't. How are we debating whether or not George Floyd deserved to live?
Exactly. And if you don't believe that the police should be abolished, but you disagree with police brutality, cool. That is at least a position to start from, because you at least see people that are getting murdered by police as people. So great. It's a start.
We can work with that.
Right, exactly. I can work with that. I cannot work with you if you fundamentally don't believe that police are in the wrong. I can't. So I just want to kind of round this out, because we're going to talk for a minute about Tochi's editorial on Tor.com, which has to do with all this.
It does, yeah.
But in 2012, Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I think that what is happening now is a sort of timeline of events that have, and obviously there were protests then, right? There were protests when Philando Castile was killed. There have been protests throughout time. I mean, obviously, there were protests when Rodney King was beaten, and then the police who beat him were found not guilty, and there were no consequences, right?
Those were straight riots.
But those were straight riots in response to a brutal beating that had no consequences.
Yep. And I just want to add to that, because I know a lot of people were talking about it. The police deliberately directed the rioters to Korean American communities. You can look this up.
Some people, like my age, remember the Rodney King riots. It was actually really interesting because Meghan Markle just came out and gave a really beautiful speech. I agreed with at least half of it. And then she started talking about being peaceful. And then I was like, okay, I'm done. But the first portion was really interesting because she was talking about being a child. She was about 12 years old, 10, 11, somewhere around there when the Rodney King riots occurred. And she remembers, going home and seeing the smoke and all of that stuff. So, like, there's people my age that remember those riots. Many of us may remember the narrative that was constructed in the media around those riots and that was constructed by the police and was continued to be upheld for a very, very long time. And those stories and that narrative has kind of, through people that are my age, which is, and younger, obviously, who then witnessed Trayvon Martin getting murdered and obviously his murderer getting off scot-free because he's a piece of shit, and so is our justice system. Like, this has been a long timeline of police brutality, and there have been some really, really interesting editorials out there where people that are older than me have talked about the events that they remember about police brutality. Because each of us, I think, has a different timeline of those events, of those memories, of those riots, of those protests, of those murders, because it's always happened. And I'm hoping, beyond hope, that the fascism of this current regime and the utilization of those fascist strategies getting exposed is enough to make a change in the system. And it's been really amazing to see mainstream outlets producing stories on defunding the police. Because that is a step. That is one method by which we can fight the brutality affecting Black communities in this country. It's not the only one. And if you think it's the only one, then you're dead fucking wrong. There is way more work to be done. There's so many pieces because this is systemic, right? And that's what you and I talk about that a lot and have talked about that a lot on this show. Now we're going to go into this piece by Tochi Onyebuchi.
Yeah, it's called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is a reference to the Harlan Ellison story, which I think is very apt given what that story is about. And the subtitle for this is The Duty of the Black Writer During Times of American Unrest. And this story, I think, is interesting kind of with some of what you were saying because of the perspective that it takes on the connections being drawn between U.S. culture more generally and the specific instances of violence against Black bodies. And I don't know about you, but like the part that shocked me the most about this piece, and I don't know if shock was the intent, but was when he makes the very clear connection between the ISIS sort of PR-centered atrocity porn is what he uses the phrase for, versus the same thing happening with Black bodies, because this is a thing that you see on social media. It's not just Black bodies, it happens to a lot of violent activity, but this tendency to want to share traumatic events over and over and over.
By the way, don't share those things, the videos on Twitter. You can share links to them if you really want to. Do not share the actual video under any circumstances, please.
I think that there's like a line on the level of violence that you can reasonably share before it becomes what Onyebuchi is referring to as atrocity porn. Like, it's one thing if you show protesters, then there's like someone throws a tear gas canister at them, which is violent, but there's like a separation. The point is that there's this moment where he's talking about, all of these ISIS videos and how ISIS has used these really gruesome images of like beheadings and all kinds of just horrific stuff. and how there's this clear connection being drawn between the way that we often report on and discuss, murders and attacks on Black people in the U.S., especially police murders, because we often see those, or even like the Ahmaud Arbery, right, where the video that was being shared was of his actual murder. These are horrifically graphic, and yet for someone like him, who's a Black man, it has way more weight. Like for even like your average, regular, everyday Joe white person, those videos are pretty shocking, usually. But as a Black man, to have to see those, like that's a reminder, like every day, of your value in a society, which is not much. And that is hard to read. But it's really important, I think, that he's drawing that connection, because we need to see the way in which, I think what he's trying to get at is the way that if you're Black in America, you're already existing within a terrorist state.
Right. And then the part for me that I think ties it back to what I was just talking about in terms of the systemic aspect of racism, right? This is a science fiction and fantasy podcast, so let's take it back to that and just look at the publishing world as it exists right now. And the problem with as you're talking about the atrocity porn and the videos of trauma, is that there is this sort of thirst for that trauma in the larger US consciousness.
Yep. This goes back through the whole history of US publishing.
Right, exactly. So, and he starts, he says, since before Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, I'm going to read this quote. Since before Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, narratives by Black Americans about Black Americans have performed a sort of zoological function. And that word right there, fucking, ooh.
The language in here is really good.
It's amazing. Back to quoting, in conjunction with, or perhaps with utter disregard for a work's literary merits, depending on its audience, a reader might approach such a book the way they might watch a documentary. Smooth narration, structurally sound. A chance to learn something new about seahorses. Quote, a window into the condition of contemporary Black America, reads the breathless blurb or poll quote on the cover. And in that book are likely breathtaking sentences, arresting paragraphs, gorgeous scene endings depicting the worst day of a Black character's life. The sentences will sing in a story about slavery. The hunger for this sort of story exists outside the Black writer. After all, it was William Styron, descended from slave owners, who won the Pulitzer for The Confessions of Nat Turner. But publishing is so often a closed ecosystem, and when that hunger is in the air, that air cannot help but enter the lungs of a Black writer let in through the doors. The white gaze is the eye of Sauron twice. Whether or not as a conscious decision, you write in or through or around that hunger. And maybe you give them ilmatic. You give them reportage in the form of fiction. You give them drama and beatific prose, and for the non-Black audience, the transcendent sense of transport that good fiction always offers. You also give them an education. This is a really powerful piece, and every white person should go read it.
Everybody should read it. It's really good. It's also very self-aware of what it is.
Exactly. So even as it is talking about all of that, it is all of that. It's very meta.
It's incredibly meta. I mean, it is intentionally so, right? So all of the things he's talking about, he's performing for the audience at that moment.
Especially considering the platform that he's utilizing.
Tor.com, one of probably the biggest science fiction blog sites in this field, outside of maybe sci-fi.com.
And I think one of the things that sort of occurred in the narrative of retweets over the last week was it started with those narratives by Black Americans about Black Americans that have performed a sort of zoological function, but also narratives by Black Americans for white Americans to be aware of their racism and how to confront their racism and how to deal with their racism. I mean, I'm going to be listening/reading White Fragility this weekend by Robin DiAngelo to discuss as part of a book group with the local Universalist church. Partially because I kind of want to get a sense of the church. Also because despite being someone who was sitting here and talking to Duke about all of this stuff, and I think I do confront white fragility in myself, I still need to read the book because I know there are going to be spots that I'm fucking up at. So that's what the weekend sort of started with, is those narratives. And then the reminders came, because a lot of that was actually being shared by white people talking about this subject. And then Black writers came in and gave us those reminders of, you also need to read about Black joy.
Yeah, you need to read the same kinds of stories you read when white people are at the center, which is a myriad of stories. Because a lot of this quote, the thing that immediately came up for me was in grad school, I took a class that was on the Harlem Renaissance. And that class had a really interesting moment when we started to talk about the publishing industry during the 20s in Harlem and in general publishing in the US, which is this sense that publishers are clamoring for Black voices about the life of Harlem. But what they were clamoring for was not real Harlem, right? The Harlem that the people living there experience, which is sometimes messy and sometimes corrupt and weird, and like things happen and people are going their lives, and so people love and they laugh and they cry and all of that. They wanted the sensationalist stories, right? They wanted the stories about the
Black trauma.
Yeah, I think that would be a fair way to think about it. And if you want to see a visual representation of this, there's a great film called Brother to Brother, which stars Anthony Mackie. I cannot remember the director. Great film, but it's about a young Black man living roughly in Harlem contemporary times who meets a forgotten writer of the Harlem Renaissance and has a interesting relationship with him. He's a Black gay man, I should say. And it's really interesting to see that the two generations meet, and it goes back and forth between times that kind of go back and show the Harlem times. And there's an explicit scene that actually deals with this, where it's like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Wallace Thurman, like all of them kind of going in and being like, I want to write this story. And the publisher being like, great, I want it, but can you make this part a little bit more X?
Right. And this is something that has continued in the publishing industry. Like, we're not going to link to every single signal boost that I did with a Black writer last year, but the number of times that a Black writer said to me, I gave it to my publisher and they said it wasn't Black enough. Or...
What the fuck does that even mean?
Right. Or alternatively, they said that it was too Black.
Yeah. Sylvia Moreno Garcia was kind of getting similar things from a different perspective. It wasn't ethnic enough.
Right. And because this is not something that just hits Black writers, this is something that hits all marginalized writers. Right now, we're discussing about Black writers, so I'm going to keep my focus on that. But this is so common in the publishing industry that I have heard it from literally, I think, every Black writer that I have spoken to on this podcast.
It's common.
But which is why magazines like Faya Lit exists. Faya Lit basically got started because these Black writers were like, what the fuck? And we need a space that has Black editors in it. So when Black writers come to us with their stories, they are not told, black it up a little bit, or that's too Black. They are given actual editorial advice about the story itself.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I was going to add to this too is that we see this in the film industry. I think it's just easier for people to see in the film industry because a lot of film is very public in a way that is not the case for publishing, because like you buy a book, but when you go to the bookstore, like the publisher's not there to be like, by the way, this one's Black enough. Like that's not a thing that happens at the bookstore.
I
mean, the publisher's not literally sitting there. They may put cover blurbs on it that might suggest as much. But when you look at the film industry, this becomes very visible when you look at the kinds of films that are sometimes thought of as Oscar bait. Because if there are stories that are about Black people, regardless of whether they're made by Black people, the stories that typically win, there's sort of two mappings, right? There is the, I guess you might call, atrocity porn version, which is we need to go into the deep, horrible world of slavery or civil rights segregation abuses, And so we get things like 12 Years a Slave, which is a great film and is based on a true story and is a really important film and it's fantastic and it's hard as hell to watch. But then you also get other things like The Help, which is like the white savior myth stories, right? The Help, or like Driving Miss Daisy, where it's like the clearly racist white person gets like to realize like Black people are really people too, and I'm going to be less racist now. And so you either get where white people, they can sort of vicariously live through the pain of black people in slavery stories, or they get to feel good about themselves in stories where they get to be the heroes. But what we don't get to see at the Oscar table are very often are stories where black people are the heroes, right? So Selma, which was about Martin Luther King, that film basically just disappeared.
Yeah, did you hear what David Oyelowo said about that?
No.
He was in an interview, I don't know when, very just recently. Apparently, after the cast and crew of Selma wore I Can't Breathe t-shirts in remembrance of Eric Garner, Academy members said they were stirring shit, that's a quote, and wouldn't vote for the film as, quote, it wasn't their place to do that.
What?
Yeah. The second that black people take ownership of black stories, they are punished for it.
It's a problem in Hollywood. It's a problem in publishing. It's a problem in everything, basically.
We punish black people for taking a stand in this country.
We do.
Which is why fucking NFL is so full of fucking horseshit right now. Because we didn't even allow Cap to take a knee. Because that was too much. That was too much for the NFL. It was too much for America. And now they're out here going, oh, we support Black Lives Matter. And you're like, you know what? Fuck you, NFL. Fuck you. Because you weren't there when a black man tried to have a voice.
No, in fact, they conspired to get rid of him. And numerous owners, when other, especially black men, decided to stand with Colin Kaepernick, and in this case, stand by kneeling, of course, they also got blasted by owners and other major members of the NFL community. So it's actually blatant performative actions when NFL teams are talking about these things, when most of them, all of them, literally fought tooth and nail to make it so that people could not peacefully protest. Fucking kneeling is the most peaceful fucking protest you could do, but they're not allowed to do that.
This is why I'm totally pro-violence, by the way. This is basically I'm
not pro-violence, but I'm not anti-violence. I am ambivalent about violence.
Okay, fair point.
My thing is, like, there is a point at which people, you cannot tell people you're allowed to protest, but not like that, but not like that, but not like that, but not like that. There's a point at which you have to stop and say, well, either they're allowed to do one of those other kinds, or you're going to just get the most destructive version. Because why should they give two shits about what you think anymore? You've taken every other option away, right? If they can't kneel, if they can't walk peacefully in town, if they can't do any of these other forms of nonviolent protesting, then maybe a fucking Denny's got to get burned down. You know, and it's not that I prefer that. I would much prefer that they got to walk down the street and some people like fucking had a bad commute that day and they just had to think and go, you know, but it's for a good cause and maybe I should listen. That would be lovely. But unfortunately, we live in a bullshit society where especially black people are told you're allowed to protest, but not like that, but not like that, but not like that.
I think we should once again round this up. It's terrible because we're supposed to be
talking about this article.
I know. I think we did. I think we covered some aspects of it, and I would encourage everybody to go read it, please.
It's brutal.
It is brutal, and it is exactly what people in science fiction fantasy, people who are not in science fiction fantasy, and just all people should read, because especially in publishing, we need to fucking hear it. Obviously, in the science fiction and fantasy community, I've said this before, and I will say it again, there is absolutely, I think, a reason that there has thus far been one black person nominated in the podcast category of the Hugos, and that's Brandon O'Brien.
With us, yeah.
Because he is part of our fucking team. That's it. And I think that is because, one, we do not create a space for black voices in science fiction and fantasy to the extent that we need to. And two, because there actually are black voices talking about science fiction and fantasy, but not in the way that we recognize it as part of the science fiction and fantasy community. Because black people have had to literally create their own communities in science fiction and fantasy, in fandom, in media, in pop culture, in order to have voices. So we tend to not acknowledge that in the science fiction and fantasy community, that those voices do exist, but they're not, you know, and I realize this about myself. Like, last couple years I've been like, yo, if you are a Black creator and you want to have a podcast about science fiction and fantasy literature, hit me up. I will help. I will edit your show for free. And I didn't get any responses. And I keep like looking for Black podcasts about science fiction and fantasy literature. And the thing that I realized is that even I was guilty of not looking into the spaces that Black people have created for themselves in order to exist. And that's a problem. And I think we need to acknowledge that in science fiction and fantasy. There is a reason that Black creators have done things like create their own spaces, right? Like Violet.
Because they're largely not welcome elsewhere.
Exactly.
I mean, the fact that for, we're still sort of having them, but conventions were doing things like essentially like safe spaces for specific demographic, I think is really important to note, which is that the conventions only recently have become to be more accepting. And even then, there's a lot of microaggressions that a lot of people don't realize that make those spaces uncomfortable. I mean, I think even like Justina Ireland was talking about this maybe recently. I may be misremembering. It might have been in a podcast. It might have been about some other aspect of conventions that is tiring and exhausting. But it's a thing just to keep in mind that this is like how you treat people at conventions matters. And even unintentional things that you do have consequences. That could be their first convention experience and you might have ruined it.
Well, and one of the things that we're linking to is the SIFWA announcement, and hopefully that is not performative. It appears like it isn't going to be, because they have said that they are going to be taking some specific actions in order to support Black writers, including for every ticket sold, they will be giving away one ticket to a Black writer, that type of thing. Like, that is a very specific action in order to invite Black voices into what have largely been white communities. And that's really important. And I hope we see more of that from SIFWA moving forward, because it's not just about saying, oh, we're a safe space for you. It is, again, that's not where the work ends. That is where it starts.
Yeah. There'll be a whole lot of resources. We can't talk about all of them, but there'll be tons of them in the show notes on skiffyfandy.com. I will also mention that if you are inclined to support the people protesting who have been, I would argue, falsely arrested for various imagined slights against the police state of America, the National Bail Fund Network will link you to bail funds for specific areas. There is also an Act Blue like bail fund fundraiser thing that I guess is splitting them all amongst the different bail funds, but the National Bail Fund Network is a great place to start to find a bail fund to support.
So we are going to put all of those links in our show notes today, obviously, and we encourage you to look elsewhere as well. Again, this is not where the work stops. This is where it starts.
These are small things you can do.
Exactly. Even for us, this conversation that we are having is where we are going to start. So look as the year goes by, as the years go by, for us to continue this conversation. Obviously, this podcast is going to be longer than normal, but this is a much bigger conversation than 1 hour can hold.
I think this episode should give you a sense of both the perspective that Jen and I are having in this moment, but also a sense of where we still have a lot of learning to do and what the future of this podcast is probably going to address, which is not to say that it's going to be like explicitly a political podcast, as a huge chunk of this specific episode has definitely been, but it does mean that we're going to be dealing with a lot of political issues affecting the Black community, affecting Black science fiction and fantasy. We're going to be talking to authors and other creative types who come from that community, and obviously later on we'll be including more and more from other Indigenous and people of color and other groups as well. So yeah, this is just like a start. This is us rambling our way into a very sudden change.
This is a taste of what is to come, and if you do not like this taste, then I suggest that you unfollow us.
But give us all your money first.
Oh yeah, definitely give us all your money first.
Yeah, because we're straight up just going to give it straight to a Black publisher. But okay, so Bloodchild. So Bloodchild's from 1984. This story is collected in a collection called Bloodchild and Other Stories, which includes some essays and stuff by Octavia Butler. pretty much all of you know who Octavia Butler is. So if you don't know who she is, she was an author who was writing primarily in the 90s and 80s. Very important author. She was not the first Black author, but she did in 1995 receive a MacArthur grant, and I think was the first science fiction author to ever receive that. Her work includes a lot of really important books. The Xenogenesis trilogy is probably the biggest one that most people are familiar with. She also wrote a book, a sort of slavery time travel narrative called Kindred, and also Parable of a Sower, which it was part of a proposed trilogy, but unfortunately she passed before she could finish the last book, Parable of a Sower and then Parable of the Talents. But Bloodchild is one of the few stories that she's known for that was not a story that was explicitly about racial issues. Allegorically could be definitely interpreted at that way, but almost all of Octavia Butler's novels are fairly explicit that is the area that's going for. Bloodchild, which I'm sure Jen figured out by reading the note at the end of the story, was actually a response by Octavia Butler to the discovery of the botfly, which, for those that don't know, will wait for another insect to bite you, I guess is the butler's perspective on this, and then it would use the wound from that bite to lay its eggs inside, and then eventually the eggs hatch, and then they eat their way out, and then they metamorphose and they fly away as a botfly, and the cycle continues. And the premise of Bloodchild is it is a story about the Tlick and humans who are living on effectively what are preserves, because the Tlick need, like the botfly, they need a host for their young, and humans happen to be very effective hosts. But over time, we learn very quickly that the Tlick and the humans have come to a new agreement, which is that humans will not be used against their will. And so there's this very uneasy political situation in which the humans have minimal political power, but are being protected by certain factions of the Tlick, who are sort of an insectoid, I guess you'd say like a centipedal kind of species. And the main story follows a young family and their relationship with the Tlick called Tagatoi. And the main character is a boy who is ostensibly going to be the next host. And it's the conflict that arises when effectively they discover very personally what happens when the birthing process occurs, essentially, among other sort of microaggressions that occur throughout the story. It is a bit gruesome at times. I mean, not super graphically described, but the premise is pretty gruesome. Compared to some horror, Jen, it's not that gruesome.
Yeah, no, that's true. It is pretty bloody, though, so just, be aware.
It is bloody, and it is a very interesting take on the sort of, you sometimes see this in science fiction, which is like the idea of like, what happens if men could get pregnant? Our main character is a young man, adolescent, and we learn in this society that the Tlick do not prefer to use human women, primarily because, at least from the human perspective, because women need to go through their own regular birthing cycles. And if you're human and you're a little bit against this process because you're producing new hosts for the Tlick. It's an interesting way of approaching this topic of male birth, and a lot of the criticism of this story, of which there's not very much, but most of it deals with this specific aspect of the story. And it's just fascinating, even though it is, I think Jen will say here in a minute, unsettling and a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is. And so for me, first off, I made the mistake of thinking that this was somehow connected to the Xenogenesis series, which it is not. These are completely different aliens. This is a completely different relationship between aliens and humans. So don't come into this making that mistake, first off. Second off, Octavia Butler's afterword actually made me more uncomfortable in some ways and less sure about how I'm reading it. So I would love to get a Black perspective on Bloodchild, because it's complicated. So what Octavia Butler says very specifically is, quote, "It amazes me that some people have seen Bloodchild as a story of slavery. It isn't. It's a number of other things, though. On one level, it's a love story between two very different species. On another, it's a coming-of-age story in which a boy must absorb disturbing information and use it to make a decision that will affect the rest of his life. So I've read this entire story, right? And then I read that and I'm like, okay, I'm now what? Okay, because I didn't necessarily come into this thinking that it was a story about slavery, but there are some very specific words used and very specific sort of circumstances that I think you still can draw parallels to.
Absolutely.
But I think a more interesting was that I'm reading this in this space, right, of Black trauma in the United States, that, we don't have slavery per se anymore, but we still have a capitalist slavery system. And furthermore, that we still have things like systemic racism. But even more than that, you still can look back to the parallels between what's happening in this story and slavery. So obviously this is happening on a preserve, very questionable word there, because I don't think this necessarily points to Black people. That is a term that is very specifically in this country applied to Indigenous people on reservations.
Well, no, we say reservations. We typically don't say preserve. Preserve you'd apply to animals.
But I think there is still a parallel between those two spaces, right?
I don't think you're wrong there. I think you could draw a lot of different types of parallels. I think Butler's going for the animal comparison, given that the history here is that the humans originally didn't really have any choice in this matter.
And there's some interesting, like, biological components here that show that they are being treated as basically a slightly superior form of animal in terms of the breeding process, right? So there's a lot going on in this story, but I think the interesting part is that we are introduced to it not just from the point of view of Gan, who is a willing participant in the process,
quote unquote,
quote unquote willing, but that his mother has made a conscious decision not to continue participating in the process. And furthermore, as we learn later, a father who made some very specific decisions in terms of his own complicity and level of rebellion to the process. And that is that he has a gun in the household, something that is illegal, but that gun plays a very big role in a decision that Gan makes at the end of the story.
By the mother not participating, Lian is her name, you mean that she has effectively checked out. She's refused to take from the eggs. The unfertile eggs of the Talik have regenerative properties, and so they allow humans to live longer. And psychotropic as well, which is what Gan's older brother does. Gan's older brother is always eating from the eggs because he just wants to basically be high all the time, because he refuses to be a host himself. And he hates the system and he hates the Talik, essentially. But Leonis has checked out. She is not participating.
She has made the decision to die, essentially, right, instead of continuing to live and to therefore watch her children become victims of this process. Because I think she very specifically sees them as victims.
They are, in a way.
Right, they are. And that's what is, like, to me, is so fascinating about this story. Because to me, it's not the pregnancy allegories that are occurring within the story itself, right? Like, to me, babies are botflies. They don't, like, eat their way out of your stomach, but they do literally drain mothers of resources while they are incubating. That is 100% what happens. And it is a bloody, painful process. So that's not the part that I found, like, even slightly interesting, right? To me, I was like, okay, no, that's a normal pregnancy. That's just pregnancy.
It should be noted, it is bloody every time, but it is not always painful. Tagatoi's helps with the birth of some Talik, but Tagatoi is not the, I guess you'd say, mate of that particular person. And so their ability to numb that person, to have the eggs or the larva removed painlessly, is gone.
Right. And also, it's not always a process that results in death.
In fact, it's not supposed to.
But that is something that a mother takes on. That is a risk that a mother takes on. And I want to just point out very specifically that in this country, that is a risk that Black women at a much higher rate take on, is the potential for great pain and death, okay, in order to have children. But in this case, yeah, it's a dude that has to carry the child. But I think what I found fascinating about this process was, A, that his mother has made the decision not to continue to watch this, okay? B, that the reason that men are chosen is not because they are, like, more capable of the process, but because they aren't needed to have more human babies so that more Tlik can live. So, in effect, Gan's decision at the end is to bear the trauma of the birth of the Tlik in order so that his sister can live in order to bear more children. And that is a really disturbing consequence of the relationship between the Tlik and the humans in this story. It is not an easy relationship, and I would say that his consent, his inevitable consent, is not a consent predicated on freedom of choice, but on the threat of death and pain for a Black woman.
That's an interesting... I didn't read this story. I mean, you can read it that way. I didn't read this as necessarily specifically about race, but it certainly is. I would argue the ending in particular is about the illusion of choice, because to be specific here, Gan has a younger sister, Hua, who seems perfectly fine and is like willing, but too young, but is willing to do it and is ready to go. But Gan has been selected for this and has sort of, I would argue, in a way, been groomed in a certain way.
100%. It's creepy and gross.
And so when the choice at the end comes in, which is that, well, the gun, as you'd mentioned before, comes in because Gan effectively threatens to blow his own head off in order to escape this. And Tagatoi says, well, I won't take you if you don't want to, which gives that sense of choice. But in the end, we realize very quickly, but Tagatoi is just going to go to Hua, and that the process will continue with that family member instead. And Gan's response to that is, well, but she's so young and she doesn't know what choice she's making. She hasn't seen. I have. And so the choice is, I would argue, coerced in a way, maybe not intentionally by Tagatoi, because we're not in Tagatoi's head. And so we don't know exactly what Tagatoi said, but I think it could be read here as intentionally coercive. And either way, whether intentional or not, it absolutely is. And I think that's where Butler reads this as intended this is to be a story about what happens when humans are placed in a position in which they are not in the position of power anymore. And they have to make a very tough choice for survival because they can't rely on anything else to help them. And this is the choice being made, but I think using the word choice is a problem because I'm not convinced it is a choice in the sense that it's a choice of shitty options, but it's not true choice. It is problematic choice.
Right. And I will say that, like, I don't even necessarily know if these are Black characters. It's not in the text. I don't think you can actually make a very specific declaration that Butler was writing about a specific ethnicity of humans within, but I think you can absolutely read this as a story about Black trauma under slavery.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because Gan starts talking about how he tries to convince Tagatoi that humans should be shown the reality of the process.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that they can have informed consent. And Tagatoi specifically says, we made the decision not to. We don't think it's good for you to have informed consent. We'd rather leave you with the illusions. And what we find out is that the reason that his brother doesn't want to be a host and the reason that he lives his life in a drug stupor is specifically because when he was young, he saw a man consumed alive by the larvae of the Tlik
right.
that were in his body. And The man wasn't in pain.
He was killed, right? He begged for death and death was granted.
And it seems like this loving process to an extent, except that obviously I think that's why when Octavia Butler says this was about love, and specifically she says that it's about a love between species, I have a really hard time with her saying that.
It's wrong. It's not right. This is not love.
This is not love at all.
This entire story is, there are moments when clearly characters don't hate Tagatoi, specifically Tagatoi, because Tagatoi is generally pretty nice to the family, right? Feeds them the eggs and protects them and hugs them, and they gives them the little centipede hug. And there's clearly a sense that Tagatoi cares for this family, and Tagatoi is a member of a political faction, we're told, that is trying to protect humans from being treated as only as basically like stock animals. But at the same time, right, this whole relationship is one in which the humans are not really free. They're heavily restricted. They can't really go outside of the preserve they live on. They have minimal political activity. The moment you'd said earlier, right, when Tagatoi said, we decided against it, the implication for me is the Talik decided against it, not the humans.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I don't think the humans had anything to do with that decision.
Right. And so there is a sense to this that this is not a love story.
The only way that love comes in is the love that the family clearly has for each other.
Right.
And that's full stop. That's it. The love the family has for each other. Done.
That's the closest. There's clearly affection with Tagatoi, but it's...
Yeah, sure. It's like the affection of a human for its dog.
I think if Butler had taken a not first person, a third person perspective instead, there might have been more of that distance for the reader to give that sense that there might be ambiguous love there. But because we're in Gan's head and we see his thought processes at different phases, I find it much more difficult to accept this as a love story. At least any conception of love that we would see as love versus a coercive and ultimately violating relationship.
Right. This is rape. I mean, I will full out say it, that
Wow.
what Tagatoi is doing to Gan is rape. And that is because that it is consent predicated on threat. It is rape.
Yeah, and again, right, because the implication at the end is, if you don't do it, your sister will.
Right. There is an absolute power balance of here. We can 100% compare this to a white slave owner raping a black woman because he wants to. That black woman then has a child who is continued to be held in slavery. Like that's essentially what is happening here in this process.
Yeah.
And sometimes that child might be given as a gift to another person because ostensibly they are still stock as well, right?
They're stock with minimal civil rights, which is something you don't give pure stock animal, right?
I don't even necessarily see that these people have rights.
They do.
Except to the extent that they are allowed the illusion of them.
They have some specific rights granted to them. That those rights may be coerced still. They do have a choice, right? Which is that Gan can say no and will not be forcibly implanted with the eggs. In the physical sense, right? Which he'll be held down and all that stuff, right?
And that is only because, by the way, because the faction that Tagatoi is a member of believes in coerced rape as opposed to forced rape.
Yes.
That's the implication in terms of, no. That is 100% the implication, because that's why the humans have to be protected outside of the preserve. She says something about and he talks about how when he goes outside of the preserve, he is looked at with this hunger.
Right, because there are Tlik who don't respect that boundary at all. They would, if they had the power, would just simply come into the preserve and use humans as they please. There would be no asking. And you're right that Tagatoi is, by implication, in favor of coerced rape.
Yeah, it's much gentler. It's the nice kind of rape.
I just think it's really important that, though it is coercive, And that's a problem, and that is an argument that Gan needs to be making to Tagatoi at some point here that they don't really quite get into. It's implied that that's part of their conversation. It's important to recognize that the humans here do have some specific rights granted to them that still make them an underclass. They may have some rights, but that's like saying, like, after we ended slavery, well, black people have some rights. Well, okay, sure. In the sense that they're not slaves anymore, at least effectively not slaves. But there are still other systems of oppression in place, like the denial of the vote or any number of other things. And that's the same thing going on here is like, yeah, okay, like Gan can say no. And technically his sister has said, even though she's, I would argue, too young to really understand the consequences, her sister said, yeah, go for it. I'm happy. Let's have some little click babies. Let's do it. Those choices are there, but their choices are limited choices. And really, that's like the only choice they have is they can say no, but they don't have really much outside of that. And this is a disenfranchised class. Like, I think that this is explicitly they're disenfranchised. They have no influence really over the system. The Talik are making all the decisions for them, and while they are granting them rights, it's still rights being granted from an oppressive class to another class.
Right, and therefore the implication that they can very easily be taken away.
Easily, yeah. I mean, if Tagato was like, nah, fuck that shit, I'm gonna do what I want, what are the humans going to do? Like, the only reason that maybe Tagatoi doesn't do it to Gan is maybe Tagatoi is not totally, purely evil, and also because Gan has access to a gun. But other than that, like, no, I mean, there's really not. It's weird. I mean, Tagatoi clearly has some care for the family. I mean, Tagatoi doesn't want Gan to be there for the birthing, because Tagatoi knows that this Lomas, I think is his name, right? Because he's not going to have it the normal way. It's going to be incredibly brutal and very painful for him. And that's not how things are supposed to be done, right? There's I guess you'd call them a Talikian way or a humane way of doing it. And so there's some care, but that care is like limited to, it's like a dog. It's a sentient dog.
And, you know, he does know that, like, his father went through the process as well. His father was a host.
Yeah.
Possibly numerous times. We don't actually know
it's kind of implied.
How often they are used.
Yeah. It's implied they have multiple litters, except for this guy, Lomas, who, because of the traumaticness of this, he will not be asked again.
Right. Oh, that's true. Okay, so Gan knows that his father has gone through this process and survived, and he is nominally, I think he's told that it was a pleasant process for your father, right? So it's fine, it's fine.
Well, there's like some, you know, like the stingy thing, like there's some pleasurable qualities there.
Right. We'll give you pain medications when you're giving birth. It's all good.
It's implied that the stings, while initially painful, eventually become pleasurable. Not like erotically pleasurable per se.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying is I'm basically comparing it to human pregnancy, which is we'll give you some pain meds, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Like,
yeah.
Like, as opposed to getting a C-section very violently, like, because that's essentially what happens to Lomas. He gets a C-section. He gets a C-section without the benefit of painkillers, though, which is literally a horrifying process and has happened to women. This is something that does happen to women. So I think that's maybe why I came into this with such a different perspective, because I am a mother. I have given birth twice. You know, I know how it is. I also paid a lot of attention more recently to the experiences that Black women are going through in this country. And I'm very much aware of the trauma that has been inflicted on Black women in order to make it safer for white women to have babies. You know, like, there is a lot in terms of sort of pregnancy politics in this country.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes right down to it, like, pregnancy is traumatic. Unfortunately, it's way more traumatic for Black women than it is for white women, by and large. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, not necessarily in terms of this story, but just in general. I just want people to be aware of that. But that's part of the reason that I came into this story with not seeing at all any moment of this as about the birth itself, but it being about the process leading up to the birth.
I think you're right.
I mean, yes, Octavia Butler wanted to write about,
Botflies.
Botflies.
Yeah.
And I love that. But honestly, botflies are not that dissimilar from human babies. So
It's really not that dissimilar.
it's not. I'm sorry.
The only real difference is that humans are capable of giving consent, and
Right.
botflies kind of like
they don't ask.
I don't think they can, right? I think they're
Right,
incapable of
exactly.
that decision, which is I think important for this situation because the Tlick are sentient and
They
are
are.
human-like in intellect, and so they are capable of being able to ask. And clearly, that's shown in the story that they're capable of it. They just don't necessarily do it.
They choose not to. They choose not to actually get informed, non-threatened, non-coercive consent.
So I want to offer something that I think Butler was going for that I think is really interesting, but ultimately fails, but it fails in a great way because this is a really good story. I think that Butler was going for a short story version of what's sometimes referred to as a critical utopia. And if you're not familiar with critical utopias, they're not like utopias, which is like the sort of classic no place or the sort of concept of the model society constructed typically off of a central concept of how a society should be run. And then you imagine a sort of system that would work very effectively and efficiently within that. And it's usually based on the culture of the time. So he's writing, I think, in the late 1500s. And so his conception of utopia is very much indebted to that period of time. He's dealing with feudal society, blah, blah, blah. But critical utopias are different because critical utopias recognize that you cannot get model societies, but you can make the best case scenario societies out of situations in which you might have things like, but resources may be limited. You may have other kinds of societal limitations, but how do we create effective functioning societies within those limitations, whatever those may be? The most obvious example of this is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, which imagines these two worlds, one that's effectively like the Earth, which is it's got plenty of resources, and the societies that arise out of it are hyper-capitalist and tend to have, I would say, problematic relationships to civil rights, versus the moon world that is its twin, which is very hostile and the environment is difficult to live in. And so the people that have grown there have a very rigid set of standards of how society is meant to be constructed in order to survive in that harsh environment. And so there's a lot of trade focus and a lot of training for very specific tasks. And there aren't a lot of what we might think of as the innovations and the creativity that you'd expect of, say, living in the United States. Dispossessed is a fucking fabulous book, and I recommend that everybody read it. It's probably maybe Le Guin's best book. Left Hand of Darkness really is pushing for it. Anyway, the point is I'm saying critical utopia because this idea that you could have situations that are non-ideal in which there may be resource limitations or other kinds of problems. So what do you do to create a society that is maximally efficient or maximally effective or maximally adapted to that environment to the benefit of all? And I think that Butler is going for that here, which is a situation in which humans who are completely disconnected from their homeworld, right, Earth, this group of humans have lived with the Tlick for generations. They have no ability to leave. They don't have access to those resources. They cannot call for help. And so they have been presented a situation, which is you basically are in a situation where some of you have to be hosts for the Tlick. And so either it can be a situation in which you kill off the Tlick who maybe want to be more friendly, and then the ones who are more barbaric will just use you as they please, and with no regard for your feelings or your health or any of that, they'll just use you and discard you because they're more animalistic. Or the more effective society, which is, yeah, you don't have great choice in the matter, but you have at least minimal control over your body and some degree of, if not political influence, at least political protection. And so I think that the people here, that's what Butler is going for, is a form of a critical utopia in which humans have minimal choices and have to make the best of the choices allotted to them, which isn't many. And it's not a great choice, and it's not a place you or I would want to live, Jen, I imagine. I think that's fair to say. But it is still the best current option they have, given the two possibilities that are there.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And it's interesting because it's very specifically said that the humans fled their homeworld because they would have been killed or enslaved. So yes, I think this is 100% a critical utopia.
And if people are interested in this idea of critical utopia, Tom Moylan has a whole book that's on it, Demand the Impossible, which kind of goes into the period of the what we typically think of as the critical utopia period, which is the 1970s. And it's really interesting. It's academic, but it is a pretty solid book. Moylan is reasonably readable for academic writing. Which I think is saying a lot because I could be like, read Theodore Adorno, and you'd spend literally 10 years of your life trying to understand 3 pages. So I had some of my students read some Adorno, and they were like, what the fuck is he saying? And I was like, well, we're going to spend this class period going over these 6 pages. And they got it, but...
We like our academic light around here because, I just got a bachelor's degree. I was done after that, so,
I think that some of it is unintentionally unreadable, and some of it is intentionally unreadable, and some of it is difficult, but ultimately by getting through it and getting to understanding, I think is ultimately beneficial. But it's difficult to find the stuff that fits that last category because a lot of stuff fits those first 2. So, and some of it is like people writing in different languages and translating it, like philosophy and shit is like hard as hell. It's harder than translating, I think, almost anything else.
And then some of it is just like so much like the white gaze and white privilege that, it's trash anyway.
Well, you get that a lot in critical theory, so.
Exactly. But I think we're done. Are we done?
We're done. Yeah, there's a lot. And if you want to let us know what you thought about this, you can email us. And obviously, if you want to talk to us at all or have questions about this whole thing, everything we talked about, or what we're going to do for the show or whatever, or if you are a Black writer and you have a book or a comic or a podcast or I don't know, you're going to be the new Aaron Douglas, whatever, right? If you've got that and you want to reach out to us so that we can help maybe boost it or plug it or have you on the show or something, or you just want to be on a Torture Cinema, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can go to, Jen, what's the first place?
skiffyandfanty@gmail.com.
That's our email. What about where we're on the Twitters? What's our Twitter?
Oh my god, you're doing this to me again? I love you.
Hell yeah.
We did just have our 10th anniversary, so I suppose this makes sense. Our Twitter is @SkiffyandFanty.
Facebook.
I don't know. Skiffy and Fanty show?
Facebook.com/SkiffyandFanty.
Skiffy and Fanty. Yeah, that place. I don't know. It's Facebook. It's evil.
What about YouTube?
YouTube.com/SkiffyandFanty.
Correct. And our website.
Our website is skiffyandfanty.com. And more specifically, if you would like to sign up for our newsletter that Stephen Geigenmiller is amazingly still doing and doing incredibly well, that is at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter.
And you can find me at Sean Duke. That's Sean with a U. And you can find Jen at
Loop-de-loo.
Perfect.
And if you want to say fuck you to us because we said fuck you first, fuck you.
Oh, that's great, Jen.
And last but not least, marginalizations are intersectional.
Yes, absolutely. So hopefully you'll enjoy all of the stuff we're going to be doing in the very near future here. And as always, thank you for listening. Please leave us reviews on the iTunes and all that. Really helps. We'll read them out on the show.
Oh, and, maybe become a patron at patreon.com. We are going to be discussing putting some of those funds towards Black creators very soon.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out what to do. So to be more than just the show. So on that note, I will just say, Jen, that I am overdue now for my Talik birthing ceremony. So I gotta go.
Well, good luck with that. Pregnancy is always a joy.
I'm really excited because there are going to be a lot of ovipositors in that room. So, and that note, awkward ending and scene.
Bye.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter @SkiffyandFanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.